you describe yourself as a classical
Yes,
liberal,
yeah.
correct? So now what is the difference so that I can explain it to my people properly when they say, Dave, you've become a libertarian? How would you describe the difference between a classical liberal and a libertarian?
I don't think there is really such a difference. The word libertarian, strictly speaking, means an anarchist. It was originally used to describe communist anarchists of the Peter Kropotkin variety. The problem here in the United States is the good word liberal has been hijacked by social democrats. And so unlike the European continent, where liberal still means a believer in private property, limited government, little government intervention, individual liberty, pluralism, it's now in the United States come to mean something slightly different. So the word libertarian came to be used here in the United States to mean basically what everywhere else would be called a classical liberal or a liberal, full stop. So I don't think there is that much difference. There is perhaps a slight difference emerging now, in as much as increasingly the word libertarian does mean something more radical, a bit more extreme. So if you say you're a libertarian, you probably imply that you're either an anarchist or very close to it. If you say you're a classical liberal, you imply that, well, you're not an anarchist. You do think there is a necessity for government. So you're slightly more moderate. So I think that's what it's like.
So I like that distinction because that's definitely where I fall. I think there is some use of the state. And you know, as I've said, I watched the Libertarian Party, you know, their convention, and it was like they're screaming about, you know, driver's licenses. And it's like, guys, you're really missing the ball here. You know, like if we can't just let that go, because we're not going to, even if you're 100% right, there's no way to really deconstruct an entire system like this, is there? Like even if the libertarians were purely right, is there a way to actually take a somewhat functioning society and really unfurl the whole thing?
Not through the political process, anyway. No.
So burn it down.
So, but yes, but no. Well, no. The way to, if you do want to change society in the longer run, the thing to do is to do it at a grassroots level, to create alternatives to government, which I think is what you should be doing. But I think with the kind of politics you're describing is rampantly self-indulgent, I would say. This is the kind of politics of a certain kind of person who is interested in being more pure than everybody else, having an identity that is not compromising, completely pure. It's the same kind of mentality that leads people to become religious fundamentalists of one variety or another. It's a desire to be the person in the group who is right when everybody else is wrong. And so the more other people move towards your position, the more you're going to insist upon these really extreme, peculiar things that still make you distinct. So I'm afraid I'm not at all sympathetic to that kind of attitude.
Right. I mean, it just seems like a non-starter when they're screaming about legalizing heroin, which we could talk about the war on drugs, which you talk about a lot, and I'd be happy to do that. But when they're going there to start and driver's licenses to start, it's like, guys,
this is not where it is. Go for issues where you can persuade a significant part of the public to come to your position. That's what politics is about. Politics is not about striking a pose and trying to show how morally pure you are. That's just pure virtue signaling. I can say it's self-indulgent nonsense. What you want to do is make clear what your ultimate position is, but then say, well, okay, you go for issues where you can persuade a significant part of the broad public that you are right and that yours is the way to go for. And that's where you go for mainstream issues, not fringe issues like that, which may be interesting for a small number of people, but they're not going to win the election for you.
There's a fun discussion to be had, I suppose, about that stuff, but not really a broader sense.
Absolutely.
All right, so how do you decide how much state power is okay? How do you make that distinction between pure anarchy and I want something to keep the wheels on here?
Right. I think state powers, that's part of what it is, but it's not really just that. The real distinction is between what part of your life do you want to be driven by individual choice or choices made by voluntary collectives versus what part of your life do you want to be determined through some kind of collective decision-making process, through politics, if you like, through government. And I think the answer that if you're a classical liberal you would give is that you want to maximize the scope of individual decision-making, because that means greater scope for individual discovery, and it also means that most people are, you would argue, the best judges of their own interests. So if you allow people to follow their own judgment as to what their best interests are, collectively you'll end up with the best outcome that maximizes human welfare. So that leaves, though, a certain number of areas where there may be structural problems. It's very difficult to act collectively in these areas. If you want to use the technical economic terms, maybe there's a public good aspect to what you're talking about, like national defense. And in these areas, it probably does pay to do things through a collective decision-making process. There's something about these core areas that means that they are so important that they have to be done universally. You can't have a situation where, say, 90% are covered by the law enforcement system and 10% are not. That would have all kinds of major negative effects for the 90% who were covered, never mind the 10% who weren't. And so there's a kind of limited range of areas where, yes, you do definitely need a government. Now, I know there are people who will say, oh, no, you could, in theory, yes, you can do without government. But my own view is that, well, if that's the case, why isn't everyone going to Somalia? I know people say Somalia is better off than some of its neighbors. And it's true that if the choice is anarchy or Pol Pot, you will go for anarchy. But that doesn't mean that necessarily a stateless state of affairs is your first choice.
Right. So for all the people that would say, well, for the pure libertarian or whatever we want to call them at this point, that would say, no, remove the social safety net altogether. Don't help the poorest under any circumstances, because if the government gets out, then private entities and private people will fully fill that void. I suspect that's not, you don't believe that fully would work.
No, the thing is, I would ideally like to see a situation where you don't have the government providing that function, but the trouble is, how do you get from here to there?
Yeah.
And the difficulty is that if you do simply withdraw government safety net provisions, fundamental social welfare transfers, it's going to take a long time, probably, before you get something that takes its place. And in the meantime, a lot of people are going to suffer quite severely, and I don't think that's acceptable, quite honestly. So the argument should be that you should, A, through private action, develop non-state forms of welfare. We should revive mutualism, friendly societies, fraternal orders, all the great institutions that we used to have, which delivered a huge range of welfare functions very, very effectively, particularly here in the United States.
Right.
So we should be looking to do that, privately revive that. But at the same time...
But we got rid of those as the state grew,
what
right?
happens as the state grew. Plus also, though, it was due to quite concrete legislative measures, particularly ones urged by the medical profession, which were designed to drive friendly societies out of healthcare provision through what was called lodge practice. That was a purely legislative function. It wasn't crowding out by the state. It was just that a lobby group, the doctors, got legislators to pass laws which made it very, very difficult for private voluntary operation. But the other thing you need to do, going back to my original point, is to say that, well, yes, there is probably going to be a kind of bottom level provision provided by government through the political process to ensure that nobody falls below a certain minimum level, that nobody's starving in the street, people do have a minimal amount of resources so that they can actually survive. Now, what you can then do is get into a highly technical argument about what the best way of doing this is. And certainly the way we're doing it now in many Western countries is not the best way of doing it. But that's a minor argument. The major principle, I think, is you do concede, if you're in my position, that there should be some kind of residual state function of that sort. Right. Singapore probably has the best way of doing it, I would say, amongst countries.
Which is what?
Well, they have a system of forced savings where essentially you are obliged to pay money into a series of accounts, one of which covers your healthcare costs, mainly in old age, one of which gives you a pension, another one gives you protection against sickness or unemployment. Now, the crucial difference between that and the system we have is that the accounts have your name on it, so it's your money. And you make these forced savings into these accounts throughout your working life. You draw on them when you need them. And if you die, let's say you fall under the proverbial bus, all the money you've paid in, it becomes part of your estate and goes to your heirs.
That's incredible.
Now, that's a much better system than the one we have here.
That's incredible. So it doesn't just get pooled into something else and redistributed.
It's got your name in it, and it's your property. If you die, let's say you have a large amount in your
health...
The
left would not be happy with this.
I'm not sure about that. It's very effective. You've got a large amount in your health savings account to cover the really expensive part of healthcare, which is looking after you in the last 6 months of your life.
Right.
But let's say you die suddenly from a heart attack, you die like that.
Yeah.
That you won't have drawn on that fund, and it's there for your heirs. It's part of your estate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely for that. I suspect that the left, they would say, well, no, the state should be able to take that now. Well, you're gone and give it to somebody else.
Yeah, well, maybe, but I mean, the point is, I think that I would argue against that for a whole number of reasons.
Right.
But I think that that's a much better system. I'm saying that's the system they have in Singapore, which I think.
So what do they do for the people that are outside of the system? The people that are really
if you're really, really poor, the government actually makes contributions on your behalf. But Singapore is such a successful economy and society that very, very few people are on such low incomes that they can't make some contribution. And the ones who are very low incomes, to say, either the state makes the contributions entirely at a minimal level or it tops them up. But that's actually that's marginal, very small number of people there.
So if we wanted to change to a system that was a little more like that, and we've already hit on this a couple times about how incremental change is tough, but you don't want to burn it down at the same time, how beyond just making the case for it, and I hadn't even heard of that Singapore thing, so now some new people are going to hear about that concept. How do you actually start making that happen? I mean, is that, you have to start doing it at the local level? I mean, just get people elected?
That probably would require change at the national level, because you're talking about something which would replace the way Social Security is currently run. You would switch Social Security from a pay-as-you-go system to a fully funded system of this kind. That would require action by Congress, or at the very least maybe by state legislatures for some of the other forms. I think you just need to make the political case for it. And the difficulty, of course, is that you have a whole bunch of people in the existing system who can't simply be switched over to the new one. So you're going to have a period of about 30 years, certainly 20 years, where there's an overlap, where you have the new system in place and you have people who are under the old system. That's inevitable, it seems to me. And that means in the short run, this could be quite costly, but I think in the longer run, well worth doing.
Yeah, interesting. So I heard you in a video that I saw you do yesterday talk about how libertarians are generally thought of as non-interventionists.
Yeah.
You think there, although I don't think you prescribe to it, you think there is a situation where a libertarian could be for some intervention, basically. Yes. Can you explain that?
Okay. For any kind of libertarian, classical liberal, the question with foreign policy is which course of action is going to most maximize liberty, both in the country that is potentially doing the intervening, in this case the US, for example, and the part of the world where the intervention might take place. Now, that should be the guiding principle behind what your foreign policy is. Now, what I would say, and I agree with a friend of mine, Randy Barnett, on this, is
he's been on the show.
There's nothing inherent or necessary about libertarian principles that means you must be a non-interventionist. What I would argue, and here perhaps I disagree slightly with Randy, is that the number of cases where the benefit to liberty will be so great that you would support intervention is actually very, very slight. I would apply something like a just war principle. You have to show that really the benefit is bound to exceed the cost, and that this is knowable, and that the intervention can be done in a way that doesn't systematically violate human rights. So that's quite a high bar.
Yeah, wait, let's pause there for a sec. How much does the benefit have to be for you and your society, not just the people that you're potentially doing good for?
I think it's more a matter of the cost, because if you think about intervention in foreign parts of the world, one of the main arguments against that from a libertarian or classical liberal position is that it actually is bad for liberty back home in the country doing the intervening. To the extent that the United States becomes an empire, and it is an empire, let's not pussyfoot about this, that undermines republican institutions and liberty back home. And this is not a new phenomenon. Many of the things that led to the growth of the state in Great Britain were because of British intervention outside the rest of the world. The India office, which ran the Indian Empire, was our first big modern department of state, and then transformed the rest of government by its example.
So basically you do these things over there, wherever there is, and then you actually need more state power at home.
Well, not only that, it provides an example. So in order to have, for example, you need a really large military if you're going to have a kind of global interventionist role. That inevitably does things like increase the role of the military domestically, increases its purchasing power, its clout, builds up the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned against, has all kinds of bad effects. It also leads to the growth of a surveillance state. It leads to the growth of the police power of the state, which we spoke about earlier, which you might say is necessary in certain cases, but certainly not to the degree we've got it now. And it just also generally gives our rulers ideas above their station. Because if you have the mindset that, oh, we can go over and be this benevolent despot and transform the lives of these people in other parts of the world, this tends to naturally create a mindset where you think, well, there's these people here in our own society. They could do with our benevolent interference as well. And that's a very dangerous mindset.
Right. And somehow we always have money to do those adventures, but we never have money to help what's happening here.
Yeah, what a surprise.
Yeah, what could be happening there?
It benefits all kinds of people. I mean, the other quite shameful thing is that this typically involves sending young men from often poor backgrounds into harm's way, when the children of the people making these decisions are certainly not joining the military. And if they are, they're probably not going to be sent into harm's way in that way, which I think is seriously disreputable. So I think I wouldn't rule out that there are certain cases where an intervention could be on balance beneficial for liberty both at home and in the place where the intervention takes place. But I think that's vanishingly, very low probability. There are very few cases like that in my view.
Right, so let's just take Syria, for example, because that's obviously the big one at the moment. We know over 400,000 people are dead. This thing is not ending anytime soon. It's hard to know whose side we're on, what's going on with Iran and Russia, all of that stuff. Now, I think the mainstream libertarian think would be, even if we partly created this mess, we just got to cut our losses and let it be. How does ethics and morality get involved as a classical liberal, where you see, okay, we don't want to be killing more people, but maybe we could create humanitarian corridors, or maybe there's a way to do some good there, but it may not be cost effective for us.
The question is, who are the actors in this thing? Because people always say, okay, we got to do something, or what should we do? Who is the we in this sentence? Now, I think people get two things confused and conflated. One is, what should civil society do? What should or can we do as individuals? And there are all kinds of things we can do, depending on what you think is the right course of action. But the other thing, of course, it means is, what should our government, the government of the United States, the United Kingdom, wherever, do? Now, in terms of what governments should do, governments in this context are basically the purveyors of deadly force, which is their core function. And so the question, therefore, I think is it's slightly different. And really, you want to minimize harm, it seems to me. Now, I would argue that actually the course of action that will minimize harm in most cases is classic foreign policy realism. Because what you want to do is to minimize the chances of war and large-scale conflict. And I think actually channeling Bismarck is probably the way to go. Strange thing for a liberal to say, but I do think in foreign policy, asking yourself the question, what would Bismarck do, is probably a good way to go, because foreign policy realists like Bismarck do not generally cause large-scale wars. And that's what you want to do if you're looking at what the government should do. You're looking to try and minimize the amount of armed conflict that happens.
Sure. So what would Bismarck do in a situation that's already begun?
Oh,
like, it's too late for us now.
Yeah,
so they'd still stay out. But is there a moral cost, I guess is what my question is. Is there a moral cost of knowing that something horrible is happening, and that perhaps you could do something?
Again, it's who's the you,
right.
Okay? So the thing is this,
yeah.
the question is this, if you're saying there's something terrible going on there, I feel a kind of moral responsibility as a human being for the suffering of my fellow human beings in that part of the world. All kinds of things you can do. You can give money to a non-government organization or a charity, something like Médecins Sans Frontières. You might even volunteer to work with MSF as if you're a doctor or a paramedic. You might support things like the creation of, lobby the government in Syria or the combatants to allow people to leave, civilians to leave the combat zone, ceasefires. You might argue for, on the other hand, you might say, well, I think that this is the right side in this conflict, and if you feel strongly about it, pick up a gun and go and fight there. That's the honest and honourable thing to do.
Right.
Or give money to, help people acquire mercenaries and things like that. Now, on the other hand, if the government is what you're talking about, my argument is that typically, government intervention, military intervention by states in conflicts of this kind is almost always going to make the conflict more intractable, more bloody, more extensive, more long-lasting. And it's not going to be ultimately the interest even of the outside powers. So much of this is driven by the desire to avoid the other side getting on top. And so, the realist view there is, well, usually steer clear of it. Unless a vital national interest is at stake, you do not get involved, because both on pragmatic Machiavellian grounds, but also on moral grounds, because if you intervene, this is very likely to make the whole conflict worse than it otherwise would be.
Right.
In the case of Syria, I mean, let me show how this works.
Yeah.
In the case of Syria, I predicted when the Arab Spring was going on that if it came to Syria, it would be a bloodbath. Now, this didn't require great prescience on my part, because the whole point about Syria is that the government is dominated by a clan-stroke-religious sect, the Nuzairis, the Alawites, which is what Assad comes from, who come from the mountain region of Latakia. Virtually all of the other people in Syria, particularly the Sunni, Orthodox Sunni Muslims, regard them as rank heretics. That means that a democratic regime in Syria is probably not feasible at the moment, because if Assad and the Alawites give up power, they are dead. And they're not going to do it. So I knew there would be armed resistance to any movement to overthrow the state. Now, once the civil war had started, the question is, what do you do? The problem, I think, as far as Western policy goes, is that a large part of Western policy has been to try and overthrow Assad, but they have willed the end without willing the means. They've intervened, but the intervention has actually been of a kind that has simply made the conflict more intractable and gone on longer. And it's provoked countervailing intervention by the Iranians and the Russians, who, for their own strategic reasons, don't want to see Assad overthrown. So that shows how government intervention can actually make a conflict that probably would have ended one way or another much more intractable. My own view, actually, for what it's worth, is that the only really effective way of resolving that conflict is to partition Syria into 3 or 4 states. I think that's the only way to actually do it.
Yeah, I mean, incredibly, Joe Biden, when he was running for president, when he ended up being Obama's VP 8 years ago, there was a moment in the debates where he said we have to partition Syria and partition Iraq. And
exactly,
there should be an actual Kurdish nation, and the Sunni should have a nation, the Shia and all that. Yeah. And people laughed at him because it sounded very academic, and we're not going to split these countries. But at this point, Syria is not really a nation state.
That's a perfectly rational solution. He was completely right about that.
Yeah.
Anybody who looks at that part of the world and is a political realist is going to say that partitioning several of these states that were created totally artificially by the British and the French during World War.
Not even on geographic lines. I mean, really on ridiculous.
Just drawing lines in the sand, as the famous book calls it.
Yeah.
Those states are not viable. They should really be broken up, and that would be a rational, humane response to the situation we now have.
Yeah, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because we don't have that much more time, but how much of what's going on in the Middle East is just because of the guys that were drawing the map? I mean, if you look at a country like Jordan, it looks ridiculous. The shape of Jordan is absurd. It looks like a puzzle piece that got mangled. I mean, how much is just that the people actually drawing the map had nothing to do with what was happening on the ground?
A lot.
And by the way, I don't blame you guys solely for that, because the Ottoman Empire ran a lot of it for a long time.
Well, no, actually, seriously, if you talk to most Turks, what they will say pretty quickly is that things were working a lot better there when they ran it. That's a widespread Turkish view. If France and Britain had followed the Ottomans and used the Ottoman local government units, things might well have worked out better, because those units actually reflected underlying realities in many cases. But no, that's part of the problem. Part of the problem in there, as in large areas of Africa, is that you have political units which do not make demographic sense. But it's not just that. I think there are other factors as well. There's been a collapse in the government in that a huge area of the world, Central Africa up through the Middle East, places like Libya, for example. What has happened is that the political order has collapsed. And what we're seeing is lots of violence caused by non-state actors. Basically clans, gangs, tribes, terrorist groups. We call them terrorist groups, but we might as well call them criminal gangs. That's what they are, basically. And until some kind of stable political order is recreated in that part of the world, I don't see that state of chaos ending anytime soon. The problem is that the existing political order, and this is where those guys, Sykes and Picot, come in, is simply not sustainable, because it's based on an irrational thing. The other thing that's going on there is that basically you've had very, very rapid population growth in that part of the world in the last 30 to 40 years. Probably more than that region can sustain ecologically, and you have an economy in large parts of that region which is A, very badly run because it's corrupt and you have incompetent governments, and B, is very dependent upon oil. And what you have now is lots and lots of unemployed but overeducated young men. And that is always and everywhere a recipe for trouble.
Right, it's fertile ground for terrorism,
Absolutely.
I think, is
and
what
war
Bill
of
Maher
all
says.
kinds,
Yeah, is there a little saving grace in that, because of the internet now, and that information can spread so fast, that these people are learning there's other ways of life, and that maybe that ultimately will be what allows them to, as they get older, to create societies that'll be a little more egalitarian?
Hopefully, yes. I think I am optimistic in the longer term. In the short term, I'm a pessimist, I'm afraid. In the longer and medium term, I'm an optimist for that part of the world, as I am for most of the world, because I do think that things like that mean that the world is going to become more interconnected. People are going to be more aware of different ways of doing things. To go back to what we spoke about earlier, they'll realize that their identity is not something that they're stuck with, that they can actually shape their own life more. But I think it's going to be a while before we get there, I'm afraid.